Greetings, ladies and managers, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called Iron, written by Uncommonality. The Fae are cruel beings. Some historians pose that they are merely aligned to a different type of morality, unable to comprehend the concept of good or evil, or understanding said concepts in a different way. This is true, but does not absolve them. Indeed, they are aligned to a different view of morality, but it is an entirely mundane one. Anything which amuses them is good, while anything which does not is evil. Mixed with a hefty disregard for the lives of anything but their own, it results in something quite easy to understand: cruelty.
"Dance, human, dance!"
squealed the pixie, tugging ethereal strings linked to the corpse of animating it in a mockery of life. All around lay yet more bodies, struck down by magics incomprehensible. Some were rent apart, flesh from bone. Others were twisted in a mockery of their former shape. All were dead. Fluttering across the grim sight was a swarm of pixies, the lowest among fae, considered such by the brethren because their tiny heads did not contain as complex a mind as, say, a red cap or a changeling. However, making up for their general lack of focus and alertiveness was an instinctual mastery of thread magic, the kind of sorcery which affected webs of meaning spun between things and people. It was a meaning spun between the dead human's limbs and their purpose of movement which the pixie was plucking, recalling a kind of sorcerous memory inherent to the oft-used things, such as legs for walking. Were the pixies more intelligent or concerned for the future, they would have been able to take over the entire Fae Empire effortlessly. But they themselves were unable to care, and the other side was obviously not telling them. Or, as seedy and unseedy courts were, say, while trying to stab each other to death, the good of the Empire trumps everything. Empty words, sure, but still followed. The current emperor, an unpleasant headless horseman who was adorned with many stolen names as there was tongues tied to his disembodied head's helmet, had made a gambit made before by countless predecessors, attempting to avoid their fate of being murdered by their successors, to distract both courts as well as the citizenry through conquest. The empire required ever more resources, not just simply food, but also entertainment and more specialty resources such as a blend of stolen years to maintain the overworld's splendorous appearance and cover its rotten scent, or a steady supply of tormented screams to feed into the soul forges to keep their army standing. Thus assured of victory, the Rider King ordered a fresh riftway torn within the firmament, sealing shut the gateway to their lost playground. They emerged into a world of startling physicality and, inversely, very little sorcery. An easy conquest. The locals, or human, as they called themselves, a fitting name considering the variety of shades they came in, tried to fight back, of course, but being magicless, their weapons amounted to very little in terms of damage. The most basic spell taught to every soldier of the Fae was the enspelling of the Thrushine, a kind of illusionary shapeshifting which rendered them entirely intangible to anything but other magic. Not very useful against other Fae, who could use spells in combat, or some of the more sorcerous worlds, but perfect for this one. The realm called soil, or ground by its inhabitants, was so devoid of any kind of magic that Thrushine could actually allow passage through walls, a discovery the Fae made judicious use of. More than one human was run through while uselessly firing some kind of handheld ballista, whose lead projectiles harmlessly passed through the Thrushine of the Fae approaching them, and more were slaughtered trying to hide behind walls and doors they thought would keep them safe. However, all of that changed when one of the humans had a chance encounter with a Fae soldier in their basement. Marcus looked around desperately for some kind of weapon to drive away the ghost currently pulling itself through the wall. He'd seen them decapitate and slaughter local police and civilians just a few hours before, and had fled into his basement to hide when he saw that bullets passed through them as though they were made of air. A few people had tried to swing clubs and broken fencing, but that also seemed to pass through the ghosts. His eyes locked on an old cast-iron pan he'd inherited from his nana, and sent a silent prayer to anyone who might listen. Hefting the heavy object, he saw the ghost unsheath its sword to kill him, or worse, and just swung. The spectre didn't move to block, obviously expecting it to pass through it like everything else, all the way until the pan collided with the side of its helmet in a thunderous clong, which sent it to the ground, the see-through flickering like a TV with a bad reception. Both Marcus and the ghost were stunned for a moment, staring at the pan. Then the human gave a wordless shout and brought the cooking utensil down again and again and again until all was left of the fairy was a pile of glittering ash. As more of their victims discovered the nature of iron, the Fae realized their conquest might not be as effortless as they first assumed. However, even though the humans seemed to have found an advantage, it did not win them the war. They were still vulnerable to swords, after all. The Fae beachhead conjured around their riftgate was heavily defended as anything could be while outside the otherworld. There was so much magic in the air that while nearby plants, animals, and even pure elements such as copper would rapidly wilt, regress in time, or even violently transform into something else. This blasted wasteland was a perfect defense, even if one of the human flying machines managed to survive the air above. Anything it tried to throw down would be reduced into ineffectiveness once it reached the surface. The same went for their long-range siege weapons, whose projectiles became bows of flowers, sand, mist, globs of water, or a variety of other harmless things before they even came close to the Fae encampment. From the shimmering dome rode war parties on spectral steeds, slicing through any mortals they came across, though their swords were occasionally stopped by the human-handled ballista if they happened to be made of iron or steel. Iron, they found, was totally invincible to magic and broke more fragile spells on contact, but it was not invulnerable, and the less pure, the more easily affected. Iron tanks nearing the defensive dome, for instance, would reflect the wild magics of the area, but would not be able to resist secondary effects, such as the ground beneath them turning to quicksand or spontaneously igniting, turning the human war machine into metal coffins or big cooking pots. By far the most devastating weapon the human possessed was iron-tipped bolts for their handheld weaponry. A hail of metal darts moving faster than the eye could see would tear through a Fae with the enspelling of throughshine, which allowed the human to take back vast amounts of land which had been conquered in the first hours of the invasion. However, the Fae are nothing but clever, so they quickly developed strategies around this. Throughshine could allow them to move through the ground like it was water, a luxury not afforded to the enemy's weaponry, allowing them to emerge below or simply move underneath the enemy's lines of battle. Locked into a rough stalemate, both sides were unwilling to make major moves for fear the other would discover more of an advantage against them. Back in the Underworld, both courts were on the verge of turning on the Rider King for bringing this to pass, and the nigh-dethroned ruler was desperate for any sort of victory to extend his own life. So he ordered his armies to move. The humans hadn't been idle, of course. As soon as the invasion was deadlocked, research began on ways to counter these beings. Iron worked, of course, and weapons were in the process of being retrofitted with iron tips and payloads. But a lot of things could not be made from iron, and non-iron things were vulnerable to the dead zone. Bombs and artillery were a dead end. The zone would transform the explosive charge into ineffectiveness as the weapon fell, turning it inert, and too little was known about the enemy's influence to tell for sure how to guard against their energies. There was very little which could pass into the zone unmolested. Even things encased in iron would eventually be affected through means unknown. as the enemy penetrated from impossible directions and unseen angles. No. The only thing which could work was a solid iron projectile, fired so fast its kinetic energy alone would cause enough damage to break their beachhead. A rail gun. The human were holding, but barely. Magic worked against them, lacking any inherent sorcery, though they seemed to have gotten wise and wore iron bands around their heads, preventing illusions and mental efforts from taking hold. Still, the field of battle was scarred and twisted from magic and gunfire. Just as many dead humans lay upon the ground as there were dead fays scattered about. When a human ran out of ammunition, the pixies would descend, pulling them apart with thread magic. And when a fay was wounded by the grazing shine shot, the humans were more than willing to spend another bullet to their head. The Rider King had quelled any detractors by promising glorious combat and assassinating their most vocal opponents. But his conquest was still not turning out as he had envisioned. The human were holding out and becoming more and more wise with their use of the accursed metal. They deployed a new kind of weapon, an explosive, which scattered a large amount of iron powder into the air. The grains were too small to do anything major, but inhaling them was deadly, and spells worked through fields of iron mist became distorted into uselessness. Still, they were gaining ground, and the king could tell that the human were slowly exhausting their resources. It was time. The last rocket had been launched, and the weapon was assembling itself in orbit. Less of a railgun and more of a magnetic mass driver. The weapon, currently located in Leo, was constructed from 50 different segments, individual satellites with their own propulsion. When given the order to fire, the weapon's components would align, forming a tunnel of magnetic force, capable of accelerating a payload, a 5-ton rod of steel, onto a target on the Earth's surface. It would only be able to fire once, the satellite destroying themselves in the process. But once the rod was in motion, there was very, very little that would be able to stop it. Someone gave the order. A series of flashes shone in the darkness of space, visible from the ground, and the rod accelerated, assisted by Earth's inexorable gravity, towards the alien beachhead. The Fae noticed the approaching projectile sooner than should have been possible, as those still fighting on the surface rapidly retreated towards their beachhead, chased by humans. Barely slowing in their atmosphere, the dart-shaped object barreled towards the rift gate at multiple times the speed of sound, shredding through magical defenses like wet tissue paper. Shields were cast and shattered, and eventually the Fae began to flee, flying and running back to their home realm, only to realize, in horror, that the weapon was aimed not at the camp, but at the portal itself. With a brain-shattering noise, which was not really a noise at all, the concentrated rod of anti-magic crashed through the weakened dimensional barrier, at once shattering the portal itself and yet tearing through the veil separating Earth from the other world, becoming charged like a lightning rod with violent energies as it ripped through the fabric of reality. With a wheezing, bone-deep grinding noise, space and time sealed shut, but not before an unimaginably bright flash of light shone through the closing rift, accompanied by a wave of exotic radiation. After a breathless moment, all humans near the ground cheered in jubilation. End of story. There is a new legend on the horizon. Blueberry Cat has taken the T6 Patreon spot. Thank you very much, and I'm sure that I speak for everyone when I say that. I would just like to thank our T5 members, Lord Azrical, Ambrose Cattell, Quantum Wednesday, Dragzoon WRE, Blueberry Cat, Cam Maxwell, Casper Arnholtz, Bushmaster 177, and Leslie 517. Thank you very much.